Hello, welcome back to another day of Unit 5. And today we're on Unit 5, Day 6, or Respiratory System, Day 2. Same thing, but throughout this unit, it's encompassing all of the human body systems. So we'll have, numbers, obviously, for the individual systems. So this is our second day talking about the respiratory system, and we're still talking about respiratory system anatomy. You may remember last time we talked about how the alveoli, or the little berries at the end of the branches, are the real star players in the respiratory system. So today, that's really what we're going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so humans breathe more rapidly during exercise than before it because during exercise, we experience a buildup of carbon dioxide, right? And why is there an increased level of CO2 in the blood during exercise? Well, it's because our cells are performing work, right? And that work is the reaction of cell respiration, which releases CO2 as a waste byproduct. So when we're exercising, why does that result in us having to hyperventilate, breathe more rapidly? It's so that we can release all of that excess carbon dioxide, which is why if you, go running, you'll immediately start breathing more heavily, especially if you're not in good shape. And why is that? It's because if you have an extremely healthy cardiovascular and respiratory system, meaning you exercise it frequently and consume a healthy diet, your blood vessels are all going to be working to transport the materials that you need, the carbon dioxide, out and the oxygen to your cells more efficiently. This is why some people that are trained, athletes can run or perform other types of exercise for really, really, really long periods of time when some other people might feel a little out of breath going up the stairs. It all has to do with how much exercise that these systems get and how efficiently they're able to work. So if you've ever noticed that you get a little out of breath when you're doing some exercise, the best treatment for that is actually more exercise. All right, so part A, the alveoli in the lungs. The human respiratory system is similar to the respiratory system of other mammals. Air moves through the nostrils into the nasal cavity, where tiny hairs and mucus trap dirt and other particles in the air. That's why we have nose hairs. It's not so that they poke out of the bottom of your nose when you're an old person, especially older men. It's so that we can trap all the nasty things that are in the air, right? There's pollution in the air, there's pollen in the air, and all these different things get trapped on our little nose hairs to prevent them. And by the way, you have little tiny hairs extending up into your nasal passages, and these little tiny hairs are what are preventing those things from making their way into our lungs. Unfortunately, sometimes really small things can make their way into our lungs, and those are the things that typically make us sick. Really small particles of pollen that can cause allergic reactions, small viruses like unfortunately COVID-19, or even bacteria can enter the lungs this way. And because the lungs are a porous, moist environment, it's a great breeding ground for viruses and bacteria. The air is also warmed, humidified, and tested for odor. So, in our nose, we can smell things. Part of the reason why that's important is that if we're inhaling and all of a sudden the air around us starts to smell really terrible, or there's smoke in the air, or there's something else, our nose is able to test that air and say, oh no, don't send that air further back into your body. And if ever you've like walked into something that smelled really badly, or like chemicals or anything like that, or experience something like a gas leak, you know that it's sort of instinctual. When you smell something very strong, you start to hold your breath. And that's your body trying to protect these very important tissues in the lungs. The nasal cavity then leads to the pharynx, where it meets air and food arriving from the mouth. So the pharynx is like in the back of your throat, and it is the part of your throat that connects to both your windpipe or trachea and your esophagus. So the pharynx is part of both the digestive and the respiratory system anatomy. Farther down the tube is the trachea, which is surrounded by rings of stiff cartilage that help maintain its tube-like shape, keeping it open for airflow. So remember, Unlike our esophagus that's transporting food that we need to expand and contract to get that bolus down, we do not need our windpipe to do anything like that, right? All of this work is being performed with the help of the diaphragm and through the magical process, and not really magical, just from high to low concentration process of diffusion. So we do not need any muscles in our trachea to help us breathe. We just need it to remain nice and open and ready for the air to pass through. The trachea then branches off into two bronchi. Each bronchus leads to a lung. In the two lungs, the bronchi continue branching into smaller and smaller tubes or branches called bronchioles. And just like you can see, bronchi, bronchioles, little bronchi. Most of these tubes are covered on the inside by mucus because, again, this is a nice moist environment because all that diffusion, and by tiny hair-like extensions called cilia. The cilia help keep the delicate tissues that line the lungs clean, similar to how the hairs in our nose help prevent pollution, dirt, pollen in the air from entering into our air passages. The cilia help keep the inside of our lungs clean by trapping anything that did make its way into the lungs on those little hairs to prevent it from getting stuck inside, for example, the alveoli, which need to be open and clear to facilitate gas exchange. When cilia are paralyzed by, for example, the harmful effects of cigarette smoking, think back to that lung we saw yesterday, the lungs lose much of their ability to keep themselves clean. The tiniest bronchioles end in bunches of microscopic air sacs, and those air sacs are the alveoli. They're so teeny, teeny, tiny, but yet they pack a big punch because it is the lining of the alveoli that acts as the respiratory surface for gas exchange. Blood vessels, capillaries, surround the alveoli. It is only when oxygen molecules diffuse across the lining from the alveoli into the blood vessels that they really enter the blood. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so first let's track the movement of oxygen once it is inhaled. So we first take in oxygen, or in all of the air that's in our surrounding environment, but the gas that we actually bring down into our bodies is primarily oxygen, right? That's the one we need anyway. We're inhaling nitrogen and all of these other things, but they go right back out because we want to keep that oxygen. So, and again, it's not a want, it is because of the concentration gradient between the capillaries and the alveoli. So when we inhale, the blood that is in the capillaries at the alveoli is oxygen poor blood, meaning it's rich in carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide is high in the capillaries. So the carbon dioxide diffuses across the cell membrane into the alveoli to be exhaled out, and the oxygen that's brought into the alveoli from when you inhale is brought into the bloodstream by the same process. And this happens simultaneously without any use of energy, and that's diffusion, baby. So next, from the mouth and the nasal cavity, it goes through the pharynx, which is sort of like the bus station between the esophagus and the windpipe. And when, God forbid, you're eating something and you're like talking at the same time, sometimes you can have food go down the wrong pipe, meaning it is in that pharynx area and it almost goes down the trachea instead of the esophagus. Something that's interesting as far as how harmful that might be, when that happens, food is never actually going down your trachea, because if anything made its way into your trachea, even a little small bite of food, it would go straight into the lungs. So you have such a strong reaction, and that feels so uncomfortable because you have your epiglottis there that is preventing anything extra from going into your trachea. So the epiglottis is kind of like a little cap on top of the trachea that prevents things like food or water from entering into your windpipe. Speaking of the windpipe, that's your trachea. And I keep calling it your windpipe because that's what it is, right? It's the tube that allows the passage of air in and out of the lungs. Next, after the trachea, we have the bronchi. And the bronchi are the two branches that come off of this longer pipe, the trachea. The bronchioles are now the teenier, tinier branches. You can sort of think of this like the trachea is the trunk, the bronchi are the big branches on the tree, and then the bronchioles are all the little tiny branches that extend from the larger parts of the tree. And at the end of all those little tiny branches, just like there would be on a real tree, there are little fruits or the alveoli. And I call them the fruits because that's where the magic happens. That's where all the important things are actually occurring. We have all of this other accoutrement to bring us to the alveoli. And why are they so important? Because the reason we have our respiratory system is to go through gas exchange, and the alveoli are the site of gas exchange. All right. Now, describe what happens to the cilia with constant smoking. Oh, and there's a diagram showing you all those parts. And again, the diaphragm is the muscle that we can control consciously, but that also works without our conscious effort to facilitate the movement of air. So it expands and contracts to pull air in or push air out. But the actual exchange of materials that occurs between the alveoli and the capillaries occurs via diffusion and not because of that muscular contraction. The muscular expansion and contraction is what moves the air itself, not any particular gas. So what happens to the cilia with constant smoking? When cilia are paralyzed by, for example, the harmful effects of cigarette smoking, the lungs lose much of their ability to keep themselves clean, which can eventually result in, as we saw in yesterday's video, lessened ability to fully expand and take in oxygen, and lessened ability to fully contract and exhale carbon dioxide. So you want your lungs to be nice and clean and pink and healthy so that you can take a nice big deep breath and get all that oxygen in all of your alveoli so that it can be distributed to all of your capillaries and increase that oxygen concentration in your blood. Gotta love it. Thanks, alveoli. So the diagram to the left shows gas exchange occurring in the alveoli. What gas is being diffused into the red blood cells? So what gas is being diffused into the red blood cells? That's oxygen, baby. Which gas is being diffused out of the red blood cells? That's carbon dioxide, baby. And where does gas exchange occur? The alveoli, between the alveoli and the capillaries. And diffusion occurs when these molecules move from the areas of high to low concentration. The CO2 is high in the blood vessels, which is why it diffuses out, and the oxygen is high in the alveoli, which is why it diffuses into the blood vessels. And you can see that in this diagram here. All right. Now, part B, the diaphragm. Breathing is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. Surprisingly, there are no muscles connected to the lungs. The force that drives air into the lungs comes from the ordinary air pressure. How does our body use this force to inflate the lungs? The lungs are sealed in two sacs called the pleural membranes inside the chest cavity. At the bottom of the cavity is a large flat muscle known as the diaphragm. And this is sort of the cool thing about the diaphragm. And we'll watch a little video of a model that you can use to build a lung in class next week. So when we breathe in, as you can see, the chest expands when the diaphragm contracts. So the diaphragm is not connected to the lungs, but it is inside the chest cavity. So when the diaphragm contracts or goes down, this opens up our chest and allows for us to take in air. Then when we breathe out, our chest contracts while the diaphragm relaxes. So that relaxed diaphragm decreases the volume in our chest and results in our lungs pushing the air out. So during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts and moves down. During exhalation, when we breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes or curves and relaxes or curves upwards, right? Because it's contracting, going down. When it relaxes, it's not really bending, but rather just slightly curving into a relaxed position and moves up. Air moves in and out due to air pressure changes. And this air pressure is both controlled by oh, forgive me. This air pressure is both controlled by our external environment, right? Which is why if ever you've been, for example, on the top of a mountain, you may have noticed it's more difficult to breathe there. And it's also controlled by pressure changes that happen inside the chest cavity due to this expansion and contraction of the diaphragm. All right, last but not least, let's talk about diseases of the respiratory system. Cigarette smoking causes many deaths from respiratory diseases. Evidence has shown that the chemicals in tobacco smoke can cause cancer in the lungs, esophagus, larynx, and mouth. Other diseases of the respiratory system, which smokers are more likely to get, include, and again, why are smokers more likely to get these illnesses? It's because those cilia that are meant to sort of scrub the inside of our lungs clean are not able to scrub away all the tar, nicotine, and other chemicals that are in cigarettes. And if you continually inhale chemicals like this, right, it's like breathing in pollution all the time, your lungs are going to get filled with that gunk. And that gunk is what turns the lungs black and over time impedes their ability to function. This impeding of their functioning can result in multiple illnesses, including bronchitis, which is an inflammation and swelling of the bronchial tubes. So that is very dangerous because the bronchioles are the little tiny tubes that lead to the alveoli. If your bronchioles are swollen or inflamed, it prevents you from being able to inhale and exhale efficiently, which is why if you have ever had bronchitis, you experience coughing because your body is trying to get the stuff that's clogging your bronchioles out. And unfortunately, again, if you've ever had bronchitis, you just keep coughing and coughing and coughing because nothing is going to reduce the swelling in your tissues. And those tissues can become swollen because of an illness like a bacterial infection or a virus, or also you can get something called chronic bronchitis that is caused by smoking or other exposure to airborne toxins. So how does bronchitis disrupt the flow of air into and out of our bodies? And again, you don't have to write this on your paper. This is just how do these diseases impact homeostasis? If the bronchioles swell, air can't reach the alveoli. So we're not able to fully inhale. We're not able to get the oxygen that we need in our blood or exhale the carbon dioxide that we need out of our blood. Asthma, which you're probably familiar with. I have asthma myself. The walls of the bronchi in asthma contract, restricting the flow of air. As a result, the lungs do not fill or empty normally. So this can result in shortness of breath or long-term effects such as needing daily medication to treat this illness so that you can maintain the appropriate concentration of oxygen in your blood. And asthma is the #1 cause of death for children worldwide still to this day. So asthma is harmful, but unfortunately in the United States, we have pretty reliable access to the medicine that we need to treat asthma, so we don't have many deaths of children from asthma, but it is still one of the most dangerous childhood illnesses all over the world. And here in New York City, especially uptown, where I know many of you live in the Bronx, we have one of the highest incidences of asthma in the world. So fun stuff. Not fun at all. And that's because of pollution. But I digress, both inside and outside, funnily. So asthma occurs when the bronchi contract. Bronchitis is when the bronchioles swell. So bronchitis is the smaller tubes swelling, which can be chronic, but it can also be as the result of an infection. Asthma is a long-term illness. It can exist only in childhood and then can go into remission as an adult, which is usually referred to as childhood asthma, or it can be a lifelong illness that you have. When you're experiencing an asthma attack is when the walls of the bronchi are contracting, which is not what they're supposed to do, right? We want our trachea and our bronchi to remain open, big, so that we can have air pass nice through the nice big round hole. But instead, when you have asthma, what can happen is these bronchi can start to squeeze in on themselves. This is due to inflammation, not like a muscle contraction. And this is what asthma actually is the tendency for those tubes that aren't supposed to swell to get swollen. This can be caused by triggers that are environmental or can be caused by unknown reasons that can lead to an asthma attack. But typically, a person that has asthma will have certain triggers that can lead to an attack. People that have asthma sometimes need to take daily medication, or they may just have a rescue inhaler that they need if they experience an attack. And again, in the United States, we might not think of asthma as a very serious illness, but it is the #1 cause of death for children worldwide. So emphysema, on the other hand, is not common in children, but much more common in elderly people. Emphysema is a very serious chronic disease which develops over time, mostly in lifelong smokers. People that get emphysema can also, for example, have worked in places like coal mines, where they were exposed to a tremendous amount of airborne toxins, but not necessarily because they were smoking, but that is what causes emphysema, something environmental. So this is a very serious chronic disease in which the alveoli break down, greatly reducing the total area of the respiratory surface. So that is what makes emphysema so horrifying, is it leads to some of those branches in your lungs ending at nothing. So as you lose alveoli, you slowly lose the percent of your lung that functions. And if the percent of your lungs that functions decreases too much, you're not going to be able to breathe. People that have emphysema oftentimes need to take oxygen. So you may have seen people, elderly people especially, who have sort of a breathing tube. Think the girl from Fault in Our Stars, little breathing tube, and they need that because they're not able to absorb oxygen in the same way as a healthy person's lungs do. So they need that high percent of oxygen, that high concentration of oxygen constantly flowing in. That way their remaining alveoli are able to distribute enough oxygen to the rest of their body so that they can survive. People with emphysema will experience extreme tiredness or fatigue. And the reason why is because their body doesn't have enough oxygen. And without enough oxygen, our cells can't make ATP, and over time, as that happens, it can result in death of many cells or our body's just inability to replenish cells and maintain homeostasis. Emphysema is a very, very serious condition. So how would the breakdown of alveoli impact the respiratory system? It would leave less room for gas exchange, which would mean that we would have a buildup of CO2 potentially, and also an inability to distribute oxygen to the cells that need it, resulting in a decreased ability to perform cellular respiration. And again, all of the impact that that would have on the organism. All right, so that's all we have to talk about today. Please go ahead and complete your exit ticket. I hope you enjoyed that video, and I'll see you all on Zoom next week. Bye, guys.